Fantastic. Can you hear me? Sounds like you probably can. Great. All right. Yeah, thank you. So I am actually a professor of neonatal medicine now. So I'm the crusty professor that you referred to at the beginning. I guess the first of those, very crusty. And I'd just like to say how difficult it is coming up here and talking after such inspirational speakers earlier today. So it's been fantastic. It's been a fantastic day. So we'll try and do some justice to the masterclass in applying for research for patient benefit funding. So why am I here and why are we talking about the research for patient benefit funding program? Well, I think it's because I think it is probably the most interesting and diverse and therefore potentially relevant for this audience funding program that the NIHR offers. And hopefully over the next kind of 15 or 20 minutes, I'll be able to give you a justification as to why I think that. It's also a funding stream which really focuses on supporting early career researchers. We are very keen to have applications from early career researchers, and I'm very hopeful that this course that you're on, this kind of away retreat that you're on here, learning how to apply for funding, will lead through to some fantastic applications that will come through to the research for patient benefit funding panels in the future, and we look forward to seeing those. And what I want to do is give you a bit of a run through of what we do, why we do it, and what looks good in an application. So, I don't know, has anyone here heard of research for patient benefit? Hands up. Oh, okay. So less than half. Has anyone here applied for research for patient benefit? Okay, 5 or 6. Anyone been funded by research for patient benefit? Okay, 2 or 3. Okay, great. And we've got Hayley coming up in a minute who will be able to give you the real nuts and bolts of how to write a successful application. So no pressure, Hayley, there. Okay, so it's a funding program within the NIHR, one of many. It is incredibly diverse, as I mentioned before, so it covers all specialties of health research as well as social care research, although the research for social care part has increasingly, well, will be hived off into its own research program, but it still very much looks like the research for patient benefit program, but is more focused on social care, although research for patient benefit will continue to fund social care work if it has a health focus, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. It's a response mode funding program, so we don't commission research calls. The Health Technology Assessment Program obviously is very well known and does commission research calls, so they tell you what they would like to fund. We don't do that. We wait for you to tell us what you think are important. Although increasingly we are aligning the scope with areas of recognised need, and again I'll talk a little bit about those. And that's one of the other fantastic things about the Research for Patient Benefit Programme is we've been able to, because it's quite a flexible programme, align to regional as well as national priorities. Grants come in 3 different tiers. So we have Tier 1 grants, which can be costed up to £500,000 over 3 years. And these tend to be definitive studies that are quite close to patient benefits. The hint is in the name of the program. And so these would be studies that are going to produce a definitive benefit for patients. It can be an observational study that has the potential to change practice. It may be that you can undertake a randomized controlled trial that will potentially change practice, although we recognize that the funding window of up to £500,000 is quite limited for randomized controlled trials. But that's what we're looking for at that funding Tier 1 limit. And then up to £250,000, which I think is where most RfPB funding tends to fall. These are feasibility or pilot applications, and these will be ones where there's been some early work suggesting that this may be a potentially valuable intervention, and a feasibility study which is targeted very clearly at demonstrating the feasibility of this for a future trial, which may be funded by RfPB at the Tier 1 level, so future RfPB funding, and there's a rapid fast-track program to go from a successful feasibility study to a future trial funded by RfPB, or it may well be more commonly that it's funded by the HTA program, and there is some good communication between RfPB and HTA in terms of leading to future potential larger, more multi-centre trials. And then we also have Tier 3 for applications up to £150,000. All of these are up to potentially 3 years. And these would be ones that are a little bit further away from patient benefits. So some of the earlier work, it may be developing a intervention, developing a complex intervention in particular. It may be some of the work about identifying priorities for future funding that will lead into feasibility applications potentially in the future. The thing that's different about RfPB compared to some of the other funding that the NIHR offers is that it is evaluated by regional advisory committees, and I am the chair of the London Regional Advisory Committee, and so we will take applications from the London region, and therefore we're able to, I guess, respond and tailor and prioritise the research which is funded to the local priorities in that area. There are 8 regional advisory committees, and we have 3 funding competitions per year for each of those 8 regional advisory committees. And as you can see, over the time that the RfPB programme has been established, we funded over 1,200 awards, totaling nearly £250 million. So it's a considerable amount of research, even though the individual grants are necessarily targeted at earlier career researchers or smaller studies than, say, HTA. We also have some research for social care. So these calls come out biannually, and they fund research up to £350,000. And as I said a little bit earlier, we're starting to move into its own separate independent programme. And all of these funding streams must address issues important to the NHS and to social care. So similar to funding across the NIHR, feasibility studies ahead of a major application, trials potentially can be funded within the Tier 1 applications up to £500,000, and interventions looking at how social care and NHS services work together in particular of importance, and importantly, these can be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. And we see a lot of mixed methods research coming through with both qualitative and quantitative components, and are very keen to support those, certainly at the feasibility study level. And this is something which I think is really important and really exciting, is the ad hoc and strategic calls that the RfPB programme is able to do. And some of these are regional, so we've had particular funding calls to address regional needs. So there's a recognition that in the northeast of England in particular, obstructive airway disease, obstructive pulmonary disease is a particular problem, but actually there are not so many research groups that are active in that area of the country. So we had targeted call to try and improve and drive research capacity development in airways research in the northeast, and mental health in the north is a similar regional call, and we're planning further future regional highlight notices, including other areas such as London and the south or coastal areas, so that is something very much to look out for. And I think probably of more interest maybe to this audience here is we recognise that there are underrepresented disciplines within clinical research funded by the NIHR. And we very recently had a nurses and midwives call where the lead applicant had to be a nurse or midwife in order to be applicable for the RfPB funding stream. And that was incredibly successful. We had over 100 applications to that, which is more than we would normally have, just demonstrating, I think, the real importance and the value and the breadth of demand amongst these previously potentially underrepresented disciplines and specialisms. We have another one coming up later this year for targeted at methodologists, and then in future we will have one around allied health professionals. So please do bear those in mind and put your applications in and work to develop them today and over the next few days. Within social care, they do a similar programme focusing on dementia and mental health, and these obviously all come in addition to the highlight notices that apply across the NIHR, for example for brain tumours, which has been around for quite some time. I'm just trying to highlight those. So we have our own individual and kind of independent highlight notices, if you like, within the Research for Social Care programme that we address with these strategic and ad hoc calls. This is just trying to give you an example of what we fund within the RfPB programme, because it is incredibly diverse. We fund pretty much everything, right from social care through to intensive care, which of course is an area I'm of most interest in. And as you can see here, a huge range of things. I'm sorry if this is a little bit small. I think the idea behind it really is to say that absolutely everything gets a look in. We fund all research programs within RfPB. We do tend to do a lot of work around mental health. I think mental health is probably more amenable to randomized controlled trials, for example, of things like digital interventions, which can be evaluated potentially within the funding envelope of RfPB. But that's not to say that we're not interested in feasibility studies that would lead to big national HTA-funded trials in future. We'd also like to fund those across all specialties and areas. Pediatrics doesn't come in here. I have a problem with that generally as a pediatrician, but it's funded, apparently it's represented amongst all of these things, but when we do fund pediatric work as well for anyone with that particular interest. A few words about research for social care. As I said, it's currently within the Research for Patient Benefit, but it's going to produce its own programme in September. It will still look very much like its current guise and remit within RfPB. They fund projects up to £350,000, and it's research to increase the effectiveness of social care services, provide value for money and benefit for service users. And really importantly, children's social care is now included, having been left out for several years. And they have 2 calls a year with a £3 million budget and have an increasing portfolio of work if you have very social care focused research. RfPB, however, does continue to fund social care research, as well as some social care research being funded within the Research for Social Care programme. And whether you should apply to RfPB or RFSC, I think, is a discussion that you're very happy to have with us within the Research for Patient Benefit programme or with your local research support or research development services. I know those are under change at the moment. And I think it focuses generally around where the benefit is going to be and where most of the interventional work that you're doing is targeted. If it's within the healthcare system, it's probably research for patient benefit, whereas if it's within the social care system, it's probably research for social care. And we recognise there's a large overlap there between those two funding kind of groups and those two places of focus. This is particularly important, I think, and I just want to make this point really clearly. We are very keen to fund new investigators, and I think there is a recognition within the NIHR that the Research for Patient Benefit programme is one that people should be targeting as an early career researcher. We will flag those applications that come from early career researchers, and we will make sure we are all cognizant of that on the panel. Generally, because we have a co-chief investigator ability to apply in that form within the programme, we would expect new investigators to be supported and mentored by a more experienced chief investigator, but not necessarily in all cases. If you can make the justification that you should be applying for this as an individual chief investigator, as an early career researcher, we'll absolutely look at that and take your application on its merit. And I think it's worth saying that within the NIHR programme's Research for Patient Benefit really does offer the best opportunity for early career researchers, and hence I think a lot of the work over the next few days will be focused around a Research for Patient Benefit type application. That said, we will evaluate the team who are supporting you, even if you are the chief investigator. And the team is absolutely critical. We expect to see all of those relevant health and related social care professionals reflected within the team, as well as methodologists and patients and parents, in my case, or public health partners included within that research team, which I'll touch again on in a minute. There's some really nice case studies online. If you're interested in the programme, which of course you all should be, please do go and have a look and see if you can find some inspirational stories, which hopefully you'll be able to. These are just some examples of people where I guess there's been probably the misunderstood idea that they're not, or they shouldn't be applying for research, and hopefully that has now been broken down by a lot of the work and a lot of these case studies that you can find online. We have new investigators here. We have Damien Rowlandson, who is now a professor of paediatric emergency medicine, but who got some of his early funding here, as well as general practitioners and midwives, just representing the breadth of different specialties who've been successful in achieving RfPB funding as an early phase towards more larger funding grants later, or other RfPB grants in future. And Hayley will be able to give you a bit more experience of her personal experience around that as well. It's a two-stage process, like most most NIHR programs are at the moment. At stage one, it's a relatively short application form, and we're really looking for information about the relevance and the importance and the patient benefit. Again, it comes back to the hint being in the name. We want to know what the patient benefit from the research that you're proposing will be. And that can be NHS, it can be social care to some degree, or care services. We do expect to see the research plan explained to a very broad group of people. So again, in keeping with most NIHR funding panels, there's about 20 people on the Research for Patient Benefit funding panel. 3 or 4 of those will be patient or public or parent representatives. And then within that, we will also have a range of clinical expertise, lots of methodology represented, statistics, health economics, qualitative researchers. And not everyone will be an expert in your subject area. So you need to explain the value, the importance, where the patient benefit is coming from to an audience that's not expertise in your area. as well as the research plan in a way that can be understood by people who are not necessarily experienced in the research methodology you're proposing. We want to see the team, and we want details of the different members of that team. Even at stage 1, we want to make sure that you're representing the relevant health areas. So for example, if your intervention or the group you're targeting cross both the hospital but also primary care, then we would expect to see involvement of primary care services within that as well. Similarly, if you're proposing an intervention that includes a lot of nursing aspects in it, we'd expect to see nursing members well represented on your team. And that team should also be very clear as to how parents, patients, and the public have been involved. And often that may involve a patient co-applicant who can then provide better links with a patient advisory group, or provide evidence of the work that you've done to develop and demonstrate patient, parent, and the public engagement. But we certainly expect to see that even at stage 1. And there's not, I think, something to be really aware of is there's now not a particular section for PPI. So you need to embed it and weave it through the entire application form. And we'll be expecting to see that across all of these different stages, including within the research team. Value for money, clearly important, and the funding envelope is not so large. So you need to explain how you're going to deliver this within the funding that we provide. And then between stage 1 and stage 2, you'll have about 6 weeks. So we will give you some feedback, we'll give you some advice following the stage 1 application if you're successful, and you've got quite a short window to turn that around. And we are aware of that. We're not going to expect you to rewrite your whole application. We'll give you advice on the things which are absolutely critical to address. At stage 2, you obviously address it in light of the comments we send you. There'll be other additional sections to complete, and there's a lot more detail that can be put into the research plan at this stage. And then they're sent generally for external review. So there will be topic experts who will provide a peer review for these, certainly for the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 applications. For Tier 3, we generally wouldn't send them for peer review unless it's in an area where we don't necessarily have expertise on the panel. And again, they'll be come back and they'll be assessed again by the committee. We get external feedback from the peer reviewers, and they will be asked to comment again on all of these different aspects. And in keeping with NHR applications across all panels now, the overall score will be between 1 and 6, and unless you're scoring 4, 5 or 6, you're probably not going to be funded. Again, external reviewers will be asked to look at the relevance, the quality of the design and research plan, the plain English statement, which I can't really stress how important the plain English statement is. It is absolutely what most of the panel will read. And I'll talk a little bit about the setup of the panel in a minute, but it's the way that you can get through to everyone on that panel rather than the people who are maybe going to take the most time to review your application. Again, they'll be interested in the team, the impact, the value, dissemination, output, as well as PPI engagement and diversity and equality, which are all now increasingly and rightly so important in the way we evaluate applications. This is the committee assessment process, so it will come through. We will have a committee of about 20 people who will be evaluating these applications. And as I said before, it's a huge range. Your application may not have necessarily, there may be no one on the committee who has exact topic expertise in your area. So if you're applying as a paediatric intensivist, for example, it's quite likely there's not going to be a paediatric intensive care doctor on the panel, although there might be a paediatrician if you're lucky, or a neonatologist if you're lucky. So you need to be able to speak to the 20 people on that panel. Across the panel, 3 people will have been asked to review your application in detail, and they will provide a triage score. One of those assessors will be a patient or a public member, and they will be marking your application almost solely on the degree to which PPI has been integrated across the whole application. And they have a third of the scoring, which helps determine at which point we discuss your application. This is a little bit nitty-gritty, but I think it's really important to understand how funding panels will evaluate and review your application. And because of that, if you have not woven in and if you've not demonstrated adequate PPI, you will be scored down probably quite harshly by that member of the reviewing panel and also by the other members of the panel as well. And because of that, you may well have a position which is very different from the one that you would have had if you had adequately woven in and integrated PPI throughout your application. We will then review these. They'll be discussed by all of the different members of the committee. It normally takes between 10 minutes or so for a stage 1 application and 15 minutes for a stage 2 application, at which point everyone on that panel will have a vote. So there's 20 people on the panel, all 20 will vote on your application, but only 3 people will probably have read it in great detail, and the chair. So you really need your plain English statement and your application generally to stand out and be clear to the other members of the panel as well. It's not just the entire application, it's really those summary sections that are absolutely critical. We have 8 regional funding committees, as I said, and these committees are broad. There's about 20 members within them, including a whole range of methodologists, clinical people, external reviewers, and PPI members. And you need to speak across that whole range of people with your funding application. We have a transparency table here. You can see these. You'll see how many are fundable at each panel. About 20% of applications will probably come through from the stage 1, and then of those we'll fund maybe about half of those at stage 2. So it's a competitive process, and it's all available. You can look and see how different panels rank up. We fund a lot of feasibility studies. They are probably the most common application that we get through to the RfPB program. There's lots of guidance out there about writing good feasibility studies. It's worth reviewing that and looking at that if you're thinking of putting a feasibility study in. You need to convince us as a committee that there is promise for this intervention, that you're going to demonstrate feasibility, but if you demonstrate feasibility, the future trial has the potential to change practice. And there are particular challenges, I think, about feasibility studies, and there are particular pitfalls. One of the main ones is we get a lot of feasibility studies which are looking to use an application or an intervention that's been demonstrated to work in one field or one patient group, and they want to see if it's going to work in another patient group. And there may be very good reasons why we need to repeat this work. We need to repeat a trial in a different patient group from one where it's already been demonstrated to work, and you need to make those very clearly. If it's just from one patient group to a subtly different patient group, we will very likely say, well, actually, there's no reason why adults in the northeast with diabetes are different from, say, adults in the southwest with diabetes. We do not need a new trial to demonstrate that this cognitive behavioral therapy to improve adherence works in one group and not the other. But if you're talking about adults in the northeast compared to, for example, people with autism, who may have a particularly different way of applying or using that intervention, then that may well be something that we'll be willing to fund at feasibility through to a future trial. But we need to be convinced of that. And we need to be sure that the application will address the kind of specific uncertainties and areas that are laid out as being very important to evaluate within feasibility studies. You need to think about who's going to fund the trial if your feasibility study is successful. It may well be that we can do that within our tier 1, £500,000 window tier, or more likely it's going to be the HTA or another funder, but we need you to demonstrate that, and we need to have that articulated to us. You need to have thought through that, and you need to have thought a little bit about what level of feasibility you need to demonstrate within your feasibility study in order to say that a future definitive trial is actually feasible. And we're not going to let you define that completely, and of course if you set your feasibility bar incredibly low, we will pick you up on that, and we'll make sure that you define a feasibility bar that is kind of more reasonable and higher. But we want to see that kind of thinking, that you've thought through the whole pipeline through to large trial, all the way through, including identifying potential funders. Other uncertainties to be resolved. We really want this to be focused on feasibility. Feasibility studies, we need to think about the patients that you're going to recruit, how you're going to retain them, how you're going to demonstrate that at the end of your feasibility study that the population is there for your larger trial. We need to make sure that the intervention is acceptable, and we would expect really quite detailed patient, parent and public involvement in this aspect of it, both at the development stage for your feasibility study and all the way through to the work that you would do for a subsequent trial. We want to see that both patients and the clinicians and staff are willing to randomize people into this study. And if there's anything particular about the nature of the research, so for example, if you're asking lots of different questionnaires to people with terminal cancer, we want to really be sure that that is both reasonable and that you've had incredibly strong PPI buy-in to support all of those different questionnaires for people who are potentially at a particularly vulnerable time. These need to reflect the nature of the study, and there is no simple formula. You need to use this and tailor it to the research question that you have in front of you. Who funds the RCTs that follow the feasibility studies? As you might expect, it is largely the HTA, although a number are also funded by the program grants, which give you maybe a little bit more flexibility for larger, really complex multi-center trials. And then a proportion are funded by the RfPB program, which is very good news, and we're hoping that will increase now that the Tier 1 funding envelope has been increased to 500,000, and there's more of an explicit emphasis on trying to fund trials within that where possible. A couple of quick notes on Tier 3. So these are the lowest value. This is the smallest funding envelope. These are ones up to £150,000. And we accept within this funding envelope that there will be a longer pathway to patient benefit. We're not expecting you to demonstrate patient benefit within, say, 5 years, which is often the kind of hallmark that is used for some of the kind of larger funded RfPB programs and for the HTA. And we recognise this may be work that's at an earlier phase. So this may be work that then will feed into a feasibility study in future, or it may be work that just sets the scene and helps us understand what the need is for research in an area that's particularly badly served by research. And again, this, as I said, is designed to fill a gap across NIHR programs for developmental work. So it would not be uncommon for work funded at Tier 3 up to £150,000 to potentially lead to a program grant or some other work in one of the other funding streams. And again, we're looking very much for innovative proposals. There's no list of what we will and won't fund. If you think you have something that fits within this tier, please come to us, make the case as strongly as you can. What do we fund? So there's lots of work around developing interventions or guidance to then test potentially in future studies. We do some systematic reviews, meta-analyses, network meta-analyses that are funded at this level as well, and secondary data analysis. And again, I think there's an increasing drive to try and ensure that we do robust observational data analysis within both Tier 3 and also Tier 1 if you can demonstrate that it will change practice and has the potential to lead to real patient benefit. Some feasibility studies, some work developing interventions, health economic evaluations of otherwise funded trials, for example, and work to kind of understand problems and where there are gaps within existing services can also be funded here within Tier 3. Okay, so just last questions before I ask Hayley to come up. The research question is, of course, critical, as it is for any funding stream. We want to know how important this research question is, what the new knowledge is, and how we're going to get to patient benefit. What's the trajectory from this question to patient benefit in the future? Why are the methods that you're proposing to use for this the correct ones to answer this question? And is the cost of doing this commensurate with the risk? And of course, that varies a little bit, because if you're going at Tier 1 up to £500,000, we want to see a clearer evidence of the fact that this is going to potentially improve and lead to patient benefit in a short time frame. Whereas at Tier 3, in the up to £150,000 tier, we'd expect this to be further away, and I guess we're more willing to take risks on the fact that this may demonstrate that something isn't feasible, for example, or that there isn't a need for that research. Just to come back to the team composition, it needs to reflect the nature of the proposed work, which I think goes without saying, and we expect people to be appropriately costed. So if you're the chief investigator for this work and you're going to be doing most of this work and you're going to be working on it for 2 days a week over the duration of the study, we would expect to see you costed at that level. What we get particularly concerned about is when an early career researcher is very undercosted and maybe someone more senior is overcosted. That kind of thing will be picked up on the panel and will be definitely looked upon unfavourably. So please be clear. We often go back to researchers and say, we're not convinced you can actually deliver this within the funding that you're asking. You need to increase the funding to some members of your team because we're really worried that they're not going to be able to dedicate enough time to deliver this important project. Roles need to be clearly described. That's often difficult at stage 1, but you need to try and do that. And we would expect to see patients or parents or public participant members often costed within the co-investigator group. That's a common thing, certainly I think at all NIHR funding, but certainly within the RfPB program. And joint leads are very much supported and looked very favourably on. So, in summary, before Hayley comes up and tells you how she did it and how she was successful, patient benefit has to be really clear. We want to see the pathway to this. It doesn't have to necessarily lead to patient benefit for the Tier 3 applications in particular. We want to see the number of people that are affected and how this is going to improve the health and wealth of the nation, of course. We want to see some evidence that the question's important, and that can be from James Linder Lyon's work, for example, or work that you've done leading up to this application. The methods need to be clear. They need to be understood by a range of people who don't necessarily have an expertise in your particular methodology or clinical area. And we need to be clear that these can actually answer the research question that you have laid out to do that. The team needs to be convincing. It needs to include all of the people who are going to potentially be affected by this intervention, the patient groups, as well as all of the different healthcare professional and methodological teams. And we expect to see people appropriately costed. We don't want to see 10 people on here at 1%. The people who are doing the work, we want to see them costed for the time that they will be spending doing this work within that application if it's funded. I'm going to come back to questions in a minute. I'm going to let Hayley come up first. But I'm just going to leave you by saying we really do want to see applications from early career researchers. We do absolutely look for them at the beginning of the meeting, and then we flag them as we go through. We're very keen to help you develop, and we will come back to you with advice and reasons if you're not funded at stage 1, and we expect you to come back with further applications, certainly, and we will give you that support and that advice as we go through. We really do want to see you, and we really want to, hopefully, get a lot of applications coming through to the RfPB panels from this group here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Hayley Wright. I'm an assistant professor from Coventry University. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about my experiences of a very unexpected success with my project application. Just to give a very quick overview of what my project was all about. It's quite a niche area, looking at supporting mental and sexual well-being after acquired brain injury. So it's a very under-researched, very under-resourced area. Whereas, you know, acquired brain injury is quite a large, kind of all-encompassing term for lots of different conditions, such as stroke, meningitis, brain tumour, for example. So the idea first came to fruition in April 2020. So I started working on this right at the start of the first COVID lockdown, which was quite a nice distraction. I intended to submit the proposal in the November 2022 round, but I think that was quite overambitious. So my first learning point was, you know, don't stick to deadlines religiously. If you feel that your application is not ready, wait until the next one. So that gave me a bit more time to do some work on the bid development. So I ran a Twitter survey, I did some PPI interviews, I published a paper which would have supported the approach to this that we used with a different patient group. So it kind of just, that space and time just gave me a bit more, just a bit more time to think and to kind of put a more convincing argument forward for why this work should be funded. So again, I delayed my submission because I had a look at what funders were funding on websites, and it was all around responses to COVID-19 and long COVID and healthcare professionals. So I made a strategic decision to delay into the next round, and so finally submitted in July 2021. So I went for tier 2 funding of 250,000, and it was over 24 months, which has fallen off. Oh no, it hasn't. No, it is. So it was broadly separated into 2 phases. So quite a short initial phase of intervention development, where we co-designing new content to support mental and sexual well-being with and for people with brain injury. And we also repurpose some of the content that we use for interventions with other patient groups, for example, cancer, long COVID. And we've gone through a process of iterative user testing. So then the next phase, which we're about to start, is a mixed methods feasibility RCT. So for this, we've got 2 arms of a trial. One arm is looking at peer-supported program, and the other is a self-directed version of the program, because what we're not sure of is, because there are so many unknowns around whether people will actually want to engage with an intervention that's focusing around sexual well-being, which is traditionally a very taboo topic, it's very contentious. We're also not sure whether peer support is the way forward. So whilst it's been very successful in improving quality of life and engagement with services for people with stroke and brain injury, we're not actually sure whether peer support is a good vehicle for supporting sexual well-being. So it might be that a self-directed approach is much more acceptable to people. So we just don't know. We've got traditional feasibility outcome measures, so we'll be looking at retention and recruitment rates, adherence, engagement, and also some qualitative data from acceptability interviews as well. So that's just a bit about the project. So I've just taken the points on the scoring from external peer reviewers that Chris mentioned, and I'm just going to give some examples of how, retrospectively looking back, how I probably hit some of those points there. So in terms of relevance, I didn't just rely on traditional research literature. I also included kind of government papers, policy briefings, and lots of PPI data woven through the application, as Chris said. I included letters of support from well-known organisations. So Headway UK were very kind in providing a letter of support for us, which I was really pleased with. So it kind of just shows that, you know, this is not just relevant for researchers, it's relevant for other organisations and, you know, the wider public as well. In reporting credible statistics, so for example, you know, Office for National Statistics data on prevalence, incidence, any subgroups, anything that you can show that this is going to be beneficial to a large number of people. And keep an eye on the wider research and funding landscape as well. So government agendas, the NHS plan, World Health Organisation strategies and agendas, and the James Lind Alliance priorities. So you can evidence those all through your application to show that your work is relevant and needed. I also worked very closely with the NIHR Research Design Service, which I'm told is going to be called something else soon. So apologies if that's a bit confusing. But they were really good, really helpful in helping me to develop the design and the appropriate analyses and outcome measures for a feasibility study. I also included a section considering risk. So mitigation for risks such as not being able to recruit to target on time, any adverse outcomes, patient safeguarding, and kind of made a contingency plan for those within the application as well. I used established frameworks and reporting guidelines just to give a sense that I didn't know what I was doing, even though there was a lot of unknowns and uncertainties that we had to address within the feasibility study. And I had some really good advice. It probably sounds so simple, and looking at it now, I just think, well, of course, but your proposal will become your project plan. So that really made me think about the finer details, and you know, thinking about if you actually have to start delivering this project tomorrow, what is it that you need to put in place? Put yourself in that position where you're actually doing the work, and it really helps you to iron out some of the finer details. Oh, I might have just, oh, that might have gone a bit wrong. So assemble your team early. Make sure that you approach people right at the start. Nobody wants to join a team at the last minute once all the decisions have been made. So what I did was sent out a one-page summary of my proposal to some potential team members through networks, and share the load, so ask them to write particular sections of the bid for you, maybe if it's something that they have particular expertise in, and make sure you keep in touch with your team as well. This can be quite a lengthy process, especially if you're like me and delay it 3 times, then it can take, you know, nearly 18 months to get it off the ground. So it's important to keep everybody up to date. The first time I had to delay the submission, I was really nervous about telling everyone because they'd all been so enthusiastic. But I just sent an email saying, I'm so sorry, it's not ready, I need to do some more work. But, you know, thank you for your time. And, you know, kind of offered them a way out if they wanted to take it. But everybody was really supportive. And, you know, the general consensus was, if you're not ready, don't submit, because it's, you know, it's not going to go anywhere. So that was good. So it's important to be honest and to keep in touch. So you be selective, I would say. Invite people based on their expertise and their genuine interest in the area and in your project, and the development of the research. So, you know, don't just invite them because they're a big name. You know, it has to be a genuine. Also, multidisciplinary teams are looked upon favourably, and also tend to deliver the best outcomes. So, for example, with a topic like mine, we're, you know, working with people with brain injury, we're looking at mental health, we're looking at sexual well-being. Covers a broad range of disciplines. So, you know, it's not possible for one person to do that on their own. Everybody needs clear roles, as Chris said. So, for example, with my application, somebody was a impact lead, somebody was PPI lead, somebody was a statistics lead. So it's just kind of like really clearly defining who brings what expertise. This has all gone a bit wrong, so I might have to answer some questions over email. Okay, let me just pick out some interesting ones. Okay, so it's maybe consider digital versus in-person aspects of your research in terms of value for money. So is it really necessary to have large groups of people, you know, descending on your organisation for a meeting when you can just do it on Teams? And as Chris said, include PPI right from the start, so it needs to be right at the heart of the proposal. It needs to be genuine and well evidenced throughout. If in doubt, ask. So this is related to EDI. So, you know, if you're not sure whether you are excluding a particular group or if you're being sensitive to certain cultural traditions, then ask, always ask, rather than assuming. And always include appropriate resources, training and payment for PPI activities. Okay, so tips from my experience is to engage with Research Design Service or whatever they're going to be called right from the start, or, you know, any support in your organisation to make sure that your proposal is as strong as it can be. Another little nugget of advice, which seems really obvious now but took me a while to learn, is update all of your linked documents at the same time. So, for example, if you make a change to your research plan, make sure you update your Gantt chart, and then make sure you update your budget to reflect that, because after all of the feedback that you get from different partners and applicants, it can get in a bit of a muddle. So do that all at the same time. And be strategic and realistic with the amount of time it will take you to write and then the amount of time it will take you to actually get around to submitting. And that is all. I just wanted to say thank you to my wonderful co-applicants and collaborators. Thank you.